how can words follow that? That was also, how can one person's words follow that? That was so beautiful. Hi. It's amazing to be here in this incredible space with all of you. I'm not overwhelmed in an overwhelmed kind of way. I'm just amazed and really moved. I just walked all the way around and looked at these signs and these case studies and these posters. And you can probably imagine how extraordinary that is to see an idea that I once sketched at my desk in Oxfam now just finding new iterations and inventions and meanings and visions in the hands of so many other people. It's incredible. I want to say, first of all, big thank you to everybody who has brought us all here today. Some people I know and many people I know I don't know, but so many people beavering away, making this space, making this possible to be here today. Can we just actually give a big hand of thank you to everybody who's brought us here? I want to say a special big thank you to Rasheen, who I know has been an amazing organizer of this morning. I'm going to come back to her in a moment. I can't help, it's gone a bit deep in me. When I'm in a room, I can't help but notice the donut. There's one right there. I'm loving the lights. And I'm so glad Rasheen talked about the paintings, because I was fascinated by those. And I'm also extremely aware of being an English person in Ireland. And I was thinking, what paintings were probably hanging there when this building was built? Whose portraits were there? And there's something kind of extraordinary about, well, that, thank you, goodbye. And then again, what is to come, and this invitation that Rasheen just mentioned of who will be the ancestors, the good ancestors of today and of tomorrow, and what images do we want to bring our own toddlers, our children, our grandchildren, nieces and nephews? Who would you want them to see, or what would you want them to see on the walls coming into a space like this? There's also another donut in this room that Rasheen mentioned, right? Stay in the social foundation. Don't touch the planetary boundaries. So keep this donut space free. Protect this amazing, beautiful room that we're in. It's also really fascinating and brilliant that it's symbolic that we're here, because it was almost 4 years ago that at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we put our platform online. We launched this platform, and they had a kind of space that anybody could suggest something, an event or something. And suddenly, I have a little printout of it here, somebody we didn't know, somebody called Rasheen Markham, popped up, and she posted this first event. In fact, I'd like to put this on the wall here today somewhere. Not on the wall, on a board. It says, Ireland, hello. Doughnut Economics Virtual Coffee. Let's get connected and meet each other over a virtual Zoom cuppa. Bring your own beverage. Looking forward to meeting you. Open dialogue on Doughnut Economics in Ireland for the places we live, work and play. And 17 people said they were going to attend. That was on Friday, the 2nd of October in 2020. And not only did it clearly lead to this and to the creation of IDEN, but something else it did is it sparked other people who were looking at the platform. Within days, there was a Doughnut Brazil gathering suddenly happening. It sparked other people. So can we just say a very, very big thank you, especially to Rasheen for doing that and for everything it's led to. So I was sitting at my desk in Oxfam in 2012. I'd just come back from maternity leave. I had twin babies. I'd spent the year immersed in the unpaid care economy of washing nappies and raising tiny toddlers. And I'd watched the world financial crisis, the meltdown. This was in 2009. Watched the meltdown of the financial system, and the economists saying we need to rewrite economics to reflect financial realities. And I just remember sitting there with these babies thinking, I'll be darned if we're only going to rewrite economics for that. We need to rewrite economics for ecological degradation, for the huge social inequalities and injustices. And when I came back to my job at Oxfam, a colleague showed me this diagram of planetary boundaries. And I had this visceral feeling of this is the beginning of new economics. But if that's the outer limit, let's draw in the inner limit, and doodled it at my desk. And stuck it in the bottom drawer of my desk, by the way, for about 6 months, because I thought, well, that's just a doodle. But every time I showed it to people, they said, oh, that's a thing. And it came from there. And it turned into this book. But what I want to say is this is just a book. It's just words on a page. And it makes all the difference in the world when we take those words off the page and actually put them to action. And the extraordinary thing for me that happened when this book came out in 2017, I wrote it as somebody who'd studied economics. I wrote it for the students of today, very much thinking about economic students and wishing they could read the book I wish I could have read when I was a student, that said, hey, if economics doesn't deeply make sense to you, don't worry, it's not you, it's economics, it needs to be rewritten. But the amazing thing that happened was that people would come up to me and say, love the ideas, I'm actually putting into practice. I'm a teacher, I'm a geography teacher, I'm teaching this. It's not on the syllabus, but I know it's what the kids should be learning. I'm a community organizer, I'm bringing this into our transition towns meeting. I'm a town councillor, could we do this in our town? I have a startup, I want to put this at the heart of my enterprise. This could be my logo. It just blew me away, all these people who actually wanted to do it. And that's why we formed Doughnut Economics Action Lab, and the meaning is in the name. It's all about action, working with people who are actually doing it. And it's one big lab because we don't know how this goes. It's a very big experiment. Every project, every case study is an experiment, but also trying to put ideas in the commons and connect is also an experiment. And it's now been going for 4 years. So I've been asked to give just a few reflections of what we've learned. I've got 5 little things we've learned, and then 3 things that I'm asking that I would love to learn along with you. So 5 things I've learned. 1, the power of pictures. We spend so much of our time, especially academically, talking about words, interrogating words and text. But actually, our visual intelligence is huge, and images can actually bypass the barriers and the blockades that words can sometimes make. And I only discovered this by seeing people's response to the donut. And it's what led me to write the book around diagrams, old diagrams that shape the way we think. They get into our visual cortex in the back of our heads, and they shape the way we think, even if we're not aware they're there. So always to pay attention to the pictures we draw, what we put at the center, what we leave at the periphery, what's made visible, what's left invisible. But also to be playful. Doughnut is, of course, a ridiculous name for the future of humanity in the living world. But many people are intimidated by economics and say, oh, I'm not very good at maths. When you stick Doughnut in front of it, they already know this is a bit different. It's playful, and we can bring other playful ideas. And I've loved seeing the playful way, including stepping into the donut this morning, that people saying this is how we begin an economic conversation. So the power of pictures and of play. And I encourage everybody, and it's wonderful that we've got people scribing and picturing what we're doing today. Keep drawing pictures, keep being playful. Secondly, when this book came out, it was so thrilling to hear back and see back how many people profoundly already shared this vision. I often said, I already think like this. I just not seen the picture before. That is how I think. One young woman said to me, could you sign my book? My father gave it to me. He said, he read it and then he gave it to me and he said, I think I now understand what it is you're doing with your life. So Doughnut is family therapy, but helping, these patterns are already in the world, and the ideas of Doughnut Economics just articulate something that many, many people are already doing, already practicing, and that there are people doing this in every institution, in every city council, in every bank. There's somebody who's trying to make this happen. We get calls from the IMF, from the World Bank, from major trade organizations, from major companies. There's someone who's trying to make it happen. So to recognize there are change makers everywhere, and how can we connect with them? Thirdly, to follow the energy, to work with people who already want to make it happen. I learned very quickly not to knock on shut doors, to spend energy being turned down by the institutions that say, thank you, dear, we love your passion, but come back when you have a business case, right? I'm not going to spend my time knocking on those institutional doors, but work with people who say, yes, this is exactly what we want to do. Yes. And this is how we're doing it. And this is how we're putting it in action. Because those people are grounded in their own reality, in their own context. And they are good judges of whether the conditions are right, whether there's opportunity to network, to build, to make things happen where they are. Of course, going with the energy doesn't mean ignoring people who don't have the time, the privilege, the resource, the contacts to put things into action, but to figure out how to bring them in, how to make sure their voice is heard too. And that, of course, is a question we ask ourselves in every space. Who is able to be here and who is not able to be here, but their voice still really matters and needs to be reflected. Also, the adaptations that come back when you put an idea in the commons, just even the posters I looked at over there, the redrawings of the donut, the renaming, the reimagining, it's the most amazing thrill and energy generating for me and for all of us in the team to see, oh, wow, look how they've done it in Copenhagen. Look what they've done in Nairobi. Look how they've turned it around for a Maori reinterpretation. So to see these iterations and how they inspire so many other people. Fourthly, the power of peer-to-peer inspiration. It's so massive. I just gave the first example of Rasheen saying, let's have an Ireland meetup. And suddenly a week later, there was a Brazil meetup. This happened also with cities. You know, I could give all the talks I like saying, what if a city used the donut as a framework for transformation? But it was when the vice mayor of sustainability in Amsterdam said, well, we're putting the donut at the heart of our circularity policy because this makes sense in our city. Within 6 weeks, the City Council of Copenhagen voted that they wanted to experiment and do the same. And then Brussels, and then Barcelona, and. Peer-to-peer inspiration, but also permission. Permission, oh, people like me are moving. I think it's time to move. And we see those ripples, so we love amplifying the work of others because it inspires people in a similar situation. And then the last learning that I want to mention is the power of bridging to very different worldviews. I've been really honored and humbled by people from indigenous worldviews getting in touch and saying, and so I'm speaking of, say, a Hawaiian indigenous scholar who I've been working with, or First Nations people in Australia, or the Maori community in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the government of Bhutan, getting in touch with us and saying, of everything we see out of Western economics, this actually starts to make sense. And we want to use it as a way of speaking to that economics. So the donut doesn't go all the way to their cosmovision, but it becomes a bridging concept, like an adjacent possible. And it's exciting seeing how it helps us bridge and connect across very, very different worldviews. So those are just 5 things that we've learned the value of and want to keep amplifying. Here are 3 things I keep asking myself and that I see as challenges, or how do we do this? So the first one is around community groups and organizing, like here today. Just acknowledging the amount of volunteer time, the amazing volunteering of time, of resource, of contacts, of skill that people offer to make things like this happen. Some people's time gets paid, some people's time is unpaid, and the delicate balance around that. How can we get more funding into creating networks? We have conversations with our funders. How can they open up the way they fund to make it easier for groups and networks to be formed? Because we know that networks are critical, right? The mycelial roots that start to make change. But also, how can community organizations keep momentum going? There's a momentum of forming, look, we're building. There can be a momentum around an election or a first event. But then what? How do we keep that momentum moving? I see it in organizations like Extinction Rebellion. What do we do next? How do we keep people engaged? And that, I think, is a really important question for how do we keep finding new ways to engage, keep feeling, seeing that we're making progress and moving forward. So I'm loving learning and seeing how different donut networks find ways to build and make reason and hooks into the news, into moments, to keep building the progress. I want to reflect on the work of city councils and local governments. There's over 90 around the world that are now using the donut or doughnut economics in some way. And the first one began 4 years ago. Journalists come. Take me to a donut city. Like, where is it? Show me the donut city, right? They don't want to see the visible outcomes. There's no place you can say, this is now a donut city. It takes time. And by the way, it was some people or a department who really started pioneering this and are now working with their colleagues. What we see in city councils is when the work really is happening, it actually goes deep and it goes inside. It may be they're creating a new tool for decision-making or budgeting or overcoming the siloed ways they're working. But it's not public and visible. Sometimes people call me up. Hi, I'm in Amsterdam. Where should I look at? Where should I go to see the donut? So people want the visibility. They want it now. Researchers doing academic research studies. I'm going to test whether or not this city has transformed. How long is enough? How patient should we be? How fast can we expect change? How can we show change even when it is deep and internal and it's going to take time? Plants build roots before they put up big shoots. So how can we make those roots visible so that we know that we're moving but not put unfair pressure on places that are actually doing deep work? And then the last one I want to mention, which is when we do start having traction, we're inevitably going to run into tensions, frictions with the wider system. And how do we then navigate that? So I just was thinking of some of the kinds of tensions we run into. In the UK, I'm running into the tension of a newly elected government and whether actually it had been a Labour government or a Conservative government that had won. I'm kind of glad we went the way we went. But it's grow, right? Growth is a very, very dominant narrative. So there's a tension there if you want to be talking about post-growth or a thriving narrative. How do you speak with policymakers and officials who actually need to use that narrative because this is what the government's saying? So there's a tension around narratives. There's a tension around the laws and regulations. A city can only do so much because it only has control over its local taxes or its local transport. It can't change national regulations, but it's massively affected by them. So at what point do we move from city level to actually changing national regulations to make the deeper transformation possible? And the local public will still hold their city council to account. You know, you said you were going to do the donut, but they can only affect so much. Budgets and devolution of power, massive constraints on how much you can actually do locally. We run into barriers of scale. Amsterdam wants to create a circular economy, but a circular economy needs to be a movement and a reuse of materials at a bigger scale than one city. So you need a network of cities or a nation or a region saying this Europe is going to be a circular economy. And then we would really be operating at the scale that works. So there are limits to how far you can go before others go with you. The power of finance, right? We're all subject to the global financial system, the logic as it's been created, the logic of capital, of returns, of financial expectations, market rates of return. How do you fly in the face of that and actually hold a different vision? And then lastly, if you are starting to be successful, then the lobby that will push back, that will try to counter, that will try to discredit, that will try to undermine. To be ready for that. That's when you know you really are successful because the lobbyists are actually putting their energy into coming back at you. But how to hold the vision and the promise and the possibility. So for me, this is all coming, it's emerging and it's coming. And how do we learn together to face up to that well? What amazes me and keeps me at this work is that every single person who said we're going to pioneer these ideas has started doing so knowing that this wider system will resist, that they'll run into bigger narrative challenges or regulatory challenges or financial challenges or pushback. And it comes from a conviction that says, and yet we start and we do it. And that's what thrills me about being in a room with folks like you, because with people say, and yet we start, and we don't know how we get there, and we don't know where that flip in the system will come, but we begin and we can feel it, whether it's in the song or in experiencing all the stories together. So I'm really looking forward to today, to learning with you, and just a big celebration of this moment, the local community work that began with a Ireland Hello, and has brought us to here. Thank you very much indeed. It was really lovely to be here with you.
A real dream come true to be here today and to be meeting you, Kate. As Roisin mentioned, I recently moved to an organisation called Business in the Community. So we're still non-profit, working with businesses that want to do better. So they're leaders in social justice and sustainability. So luckily, a lot of questions that came through from your forms that you would have filled out were to do with business, but they were to do with a lot of other areas as well. So I've put them together in a few clusters. So we have about 8 clusters, and I've looked at these questions too. So we've about 40 minutes, which is roughly 5 minutes per question. But myself and Kate will keep it conversational. And then if we have some time at the end, which is a big if, we can go to the floor. But just so you're aware, your questions have been taken on board from the form before, and these ones, I have written them all down, so you've all been heard. Okay, so I think without further ado, we'll get going.
Game and sit here and see what happens. I always think actually when people ask a really good question, you think, you know something that made you ask that really good question. So let's see what happens. But I think the answers, the beginnings of them, are all here in the room. With that, let's go.
Yes, excellent caveat to start with. So, yeah, I guess the first one is probably the biggest one, I would say, because it gets to the root of what so many of the conversations I've been part of and have overheard today have been about, and it is mindset. And it comes up again and again and again in conversations about systems, in how we change what we do personally, locally, regionally. So I suppose we've all been programmed with this idea, and you know, my parents' parents for decades, that growth is good, you know, and Gordon Gekko, greed is good. It's been drilled into us for a really long time. So how do we begin to deprogram, reprogram ourselves, politicians, everyone in society, that growth is not always good? Businesses, for example, growth is not always good, and in fact can be detrimental. And one particular question that came up was, how do we decouple the idea of Doughnut economics from ideas of recession and depression that so many people are scarred by? So start with an easy one.
Okay, let me ask, should we sit down or would you rather we stand up? Because we can also do it standing up. I'm happy. You're saying sit down. I might spring up because I get excited, and also I've got toys. But you want to talk about the mindset of growth. Okay. So just mindset, absolutely. That's why I wrote a book called 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. Not 7 ways to act or 7 policies to make. It was ways to think. And the cover of the book is just these 2 concentric circles. Like I said earlier, that what we see profoundly shapes our mindset. So always thinking about the images we create, as well as the language that we use, and going back as early as we can. Right? That I wanted to change the university curriculum. School teachers are bringing it in a secondary school, then they're bringing it in a primary school. Let's take it all the way back. What is the mindset we raise our children with? Who are we and how do we belong in this world? So that is huge. So the question on growth, I am going to spring up. person. So you said, how do we escape thinking that growth is the way forward? I think we already deeply know that that is not the ultimate meaning of thriving. So growth, here's a, right, the growth curve that economists and politicians speak to is this shape, nearly, like that. Endless economic growth, exponential growth. It doesn't stop at the top of my hose pipe. Obviously, it goes right up through the ceiling. And let's just recognize, so we're in Ireland, one of the richest countries in the EU, which means it's among the richest countries in the world. And I know that GDP and GNI don't fully reflect the reality of people's incomes here because of many multinationals bringing their profits in. But still, when you take that into account, it is one of the richer nations in the world, and as is the UK. And I imagine myself in Malawi or Niger and countries like that, looking at countries like ours, being amazed. Even here, we say, no, in order to thrive, we need to grow more. Forever, there's no end to it. So growth is a wonderful, healthy phase of life. Let's start by recognizing what is true there. We love to see our children grow, right? We see kids grow and they grow up. We see plants growing. We see nature grows. When something's growing, it means it's alive. So we love seeing things grow. It makes sense. But everything that lasts and thrives doesn't just grow endlessly, doesn't just do that. Flick of the wrist, it does this. This is actually nature's growth curve. Things grow, and they grow through, so I'm going to use my nose as a pointer for a moment. They grow through an exponential phase, right? They go through that phase, but then they grow up. Then they actually flatten out and they mature, and that's what enables them to thrive. An oak tree spends 300 years growing. It spends 300 years thriving, this bit, and then it spends 300 years dying. Because, of course, that is also what happens to each one of us and every system in the end. So this is life's growth curve. Things grow and they grow up. And then when we think about our own bodies, yes, we grow, but actually we thrive and we stay alive because we know how to be in balance. We know how to have enough food, but not too much, enough water, oxygen, heat, exercise, sleep, but not too much of any of these. It's that homeostasis of the body that means all of our body temperatures are phenomenally, miraculously almost identical because we're continually balancing ourselves all the time. That's what it means for a system to live. If we stay with the human body, if my friend goes to the doctor and the doctor tells her she has a growth, we immediately go quiet. Now, we're not celebrating growth because we deeply understand that when something tries to grow endlessly within a healthy, dynamic, living whole, it is a threat to the health of the whole. And we do everything we can to stop it. So we deeply understand in our bodies that we want our bodies to grow and grow up, but to thrive in balance. Can we take, therefore, what we deeply understand at the level of the human body to the planetary body, but also to our economies? What would it mean for an economy to grow and grow up? And I'll finish by saying what in our economies demands that exponential growth. It's the simplest word, one word for it, capital. It's the return on capital. It's that we've created a financial system that demands a return on a return on a return on a return endlessly. And to me, that's the conundrum. That's the redesign. And we need to remember that finance is a human invention. It's not natural. It's not unchangeable. We invented it. We created it. Can we redesign it so it actually aligns with the living balance of Earth? That's, for me, the deepest question, the hardest question, but that sits behind so many economic conversations.
And on finance, because that came up in our table actually with Avril over there, on and the language of how we begin to talk about different world where, you know, it's not coming up against those limits. We are living within the donut. We are living in balance. How is there an example of anywhere on the planet that has looked at the financial system in a different way to make it align with the donut? Is there an example of that happening? You know, when people invest, they are told you invest and you get a return on your investment, which ultimately depends on growth. Is there anywhere that is doing this differently, an example?
So I don't know of a place that is doing that differently. There are, of course, investors who now talk about a portfolio of investment. And some people talk about impact investment, but often when you go close up to it, what it's saying is, well, we want social and environmental returns, but of course at market rates, because we want to be smart investors. So there's no shift there. It's just demanding more. But then there are other spectrums of investment. And I think the world of philanthropy, quite rightly, is recognizing that often philanthropy comes from wealth that's been accumulated in actually exploitative or degenerative ways. If we look back into the history, how did a family or an organization come to have so much accumulated wealth? And that this can be a starting point, it should be, to repurpose that capital, that saving, that resource, to reinvest it, to spend it down, or to not demand a return from it, actually to give back. And that, again, now that's going back to the mind shift of when is it that you encounter people who have responsibility for such accumulated wealth that they also recognize it's time to give back and spend it into regeneration, spend it into distribution, to kickstart, to enable something different to begin. Those are two rare people, but some of the funders who found us, I meet them. They're often granddaughters, really interestingly. They're now maybe in their 50s, 60s. They were the great granddaughters of a great industrialist who 2 centuries ago created Velux windows or created plumbing or cement, and they inherited millions, even billions, and something in their own heads and hearts has said, and now I shift, I repurpose this money. I don't want this much. I don't need this much. And what a privilege and responsibility to release it back so it reinvests in what it was taken from.
Yeah, I think when you said granddaughter there, I thought of someone that I met years ago whose ancestors were involved in slavery in the US, and they're leading an organization, can't remember the name of it, but it is encouraging other people like them who have garnered all this wealth and encouraging them to invest it not for financial return, but for social and environmental returns only. So it's related to that first question around mindset. What is investment and what do we expect from it? Very much a systemic shift.
Yeah, and just 2 other things, since the question was about the design of finance. At the local scale, people are creating complementary currencies, which my experience of is they can be really hard to make them work, actually. We can have quite ideal ideas about setting this up, and then what makes it have traction? Why do some take off and some don't? There's a beautiful example of time banking in Switzerland, where people give their time and get time credits for supporting other people, elderly people doing their shopping and their care, so that when they in turn need it, they can call on the time of others. There's multiple examples, but they require careful design, but they show that, again, finance is not natural, it's designed. Who has the power to issue a currency? What character does that currency have? Does it bear interest? Or does it bear demurrage, which means it loses value the longer you hold it? And what can it be used for? These 3 traits shape how money shapes our behavior. There are now people making cryptocurrencies or using distributed ledger, digital designs of this. And I feel really curious and wary, because there's a huge potential to use distributed ledger technologies to design exactly for ecological regeneration and social distribution. It could be, but will they be? There's also a real possibility to design distributed ledger to accumulate millions of kind of Bitcoin. So it's a technology, and it depends whose intention is behind it and what's designed into it from the start. If anybody knows of a digital currency that you think really is being designed and used for regenerative and distributive purposes, I would love to know about it and ask the deep questions behind its design.
I think that's really interesting because you're highlighting how so many of these things we take for granted in our world, like the water we swim in, are inventions by people just like us, and the drivers of those inventions, whether it's to do with the financial system or otherwise, can be changed. You know, like the Ursula K. Le Guin has that quote about monarchs and kings and queens, and how that was a given always for so long until, you know, now that's not the norm. So these things can be changed. I'm going to pull it back a little bit to policy, because this came up a lot. There's a lot of interest in the room around specific policies that move the needle, that move the dial. You just had an election in the UK. We recently had an election. Carolyn spoke about the local elections, MEP elections. We'll have a general election by March next year. If there was one specific policy that you could get everybody in this room and everybody they know to ask the people who are going to be knocking on their doors to help us move into the donut, what would it be?
One policy. Actually, I'm just going to speak from the UK context because that's in my mind. So there are some things that the new incoming UK government have been doing, that just saying we're not going to resist, for example, challenges to the coal mine that was planned to be opened in the UK, challenges to Rosebank oil field. So they are pulling away where the last government were wanting to max out on fossil fuels. So we're seeing a shift there. But one thing that I not seeing the current government, they're very grow, grow, grow. In fact, Rachel Reeves, our Chancellor, says we need to pull back on planning laws because we need to build lots of housing, because we need to grow. I mean, even just the logic of that argument is very strange to me. Surely we need housing, right? We don't build housing to grow. But what we're not talking about in the UK is a circular economy. And there's a strong awareness of the need to cut carbon emissions in many countries. Most countries not doing anything like enough, but very few nations have recognized it's not just about carbon. It's about material. The materials, you know, we can use this from timber to our clothing, to plastics, to food, to water, to our use of land and resources that is drawing on global supply chains from the whole world. That is also massively overshooting. And I think if we put in place designs to say we are going to create a circular or cyclical reuse, refurbish, refit, and this is the cutting edge of 21st century design. By the way, it will create local jobs. By the way, it will be incredibly creative. By the way, it will bring people back to local place. And by the way, it's our responsibility. I think that vision needs to happen at the national scale. Cities are trying to do it, but there's only so much a city can do. And we need to shift our taxes from taxing companies for employing people to taxing companies for using new materials, continually excavating new materials we should be reusing. If you make that shift from taxing labor to taxing resources, the logic of what we're being efficient around shifts too.
So taxing, did everybody hear that? We want to see our next politicians taxing resources as well as labor, I would say. Yeah, I think, and I spotted Claire from the Rediscovery Centre here, which is a fantastic example of that circularity and creativity in practice. So imagine if we had a lot more of the likes of the Rediscovery Centre around the country, and so many fantastic initiatives. We heard the case studies that were up here earlier on. Where's the resourcing for the likes of circularity in those communities? These are very specific things that we can ask for. You mentioned supply chains there and global supply chains. So the next question I'm going to ask you on is one that's very close to my heart, which is about business. So we all know that so many businesses, their language is profit and loss so much. And there's very much a push for increased ESG, environmental, social and governance action now. But still there are those barriers of the boardroom. The CEO reports to the board reports to the shareholders, and the shareholders think in short-term cycles and they think in terms of profit. So how do we bring the donut into the boardroom, into the AGM, and make this the fulcrum around which business operates?
Yeah, great question, and a really key one. And again, businesses are designed. So lots of companies Ever since I first published the Doughnut in 2012, lots of companies from really big multinationals to tiny startups have got in touch and sometimes said, this could be our logo, or we want to bring our multinational into the Doughnut. How do we do it? It's been an area of work that we've been really careful around because it's an area where you can imagine that this could very quickly get greenwashed. Lots of companies would love to stick the Doughnut on their website and have a little strap line and, and it just gets greenwashed away. So whenever we talk with companies, they'll often start by saying, look at the design of my product. It's recycled. We pay fair wages. And we'll often say, lovely product. We don't actually want to focus on the design of your product. What we think ultimately matters is the design of your company itself, the deep design of your company. And there are 5 design traits that we always talk about. So I usually wave a little signboard. My cardboard wasn't going to travel well on the train and ferry. So I have 5 objects. I'll talk about it quickly. I'll just say the 5 categories first. Your purpose, your networks, your governance, how you're owned, ownership, and finance. So first of all, purpose, and I always carry a little compass. What is your compass? What are you actually aiming for? What is the purpose of your company? Why does it exist? What is it in service to in the world? Think of phone companies. They might say, I want to be the biggest mobile phone company in Europe. Well, goody for you. If you talk to Fairphone, which is a Dutch phone company, their goal actually is to end slavery and misuse in the phone market. Their goal is much bigger than themselves. Or Tony's Chocolonely, which is a Dutch chocolate company, their goal is to create slavery, to create a world of slavery-free chocolate is the norm. Again, they're not talking about themselves. They're talking about the market in which they operate, and they are using business as a vehicle for transformation. So what is your purpose and why do you exist? Second, your networks. I have to use this lovely ball, right? Think of all the networks of relationship a company has. You have your employees, your relationships and contracts with employees, with suppliers, with customers, with your industry allies, or are they all your competitors? How do you hold your relationships? Do you actually live out your values in those relationships, or are they extractive and short term? There's a company in Germany called El Puente. They buy fair trade products from all over the world. During COVID, when many companies were minimizing contracts, shutting them down, turning away their creditors, El Puente did the opposite, and they reached out and they said, we'll pay you up front. Deliver when you can. This is exactly why we exist. We work in solidarity. Our supply chain is one of solidarity. So what are the quality of your relationships and networks? Thirdly, governance, for which I have a little microphone. Whose voice is heard in decision-making? I mean, who's even in the room when the board get together? Who's heard? Are the workers heard? Are future generations heard? Does nature have a voice? There's a shampoo company called Faith in Nature. They kept asking themselves, what would nature do? What would nature want us to do? And they said, well, we just keep asking this. Let's actually put nature on the board. So they were the first company to make nature one of 11 directors on the board. And nature is represented by an environmental lawyer who doesn't have a veto over everything else, but has equal voice, bringing that onto the board. So how is the company governed? What are the metrics of success? Is it a quarterly report? Multinationals, we know, have to show every quarter. They've got growing sales, growing market share, growing profits. That's a trap. Very, very difficult to become regenerative and distributive when you've got that tight performance. So governance. Next one. And the further down we go, it gets more profound. I sometimes call this corporate psychotherapy. Like the deepest you go, we need to talk about your mother. Well, the further down we go. So now we're talking about, the keys, ownership. Who owns this company? Is it owned by a family for 300 years? Is it owned by venture capital or shareholders? Is it owned by the state? Is it owned by its employees or by customers? These are all prevalent designs of companies. But how it's owned, who owns it, or stewards it, right? Steward-owned companies are really interesting to design that. Who owns and stewards it shapes the one that sits at the bottom, and it's in my bag, I couldn't get out. It is, of course, it's everywhere. Finance. Where does the finance behind this company come from? Is this company financed out of its revenue and is growing organically from its sales? That will be a tiny company that growing slowly over time. Is it financed by share issue? Is it financed by private equity, by venture capital, by state grants? Because how it's financed, where that finance comes from, profoundly shapes what that finance expects and demands, and what it extracts for its owners, the return on capital, that there we are touching it again, what it extracts for its owners, or what it reinvests in the purpose. And just thinking back, purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance, we can all think of companies that are basically driven, they're owned and governed in order to return the maximum financial returns to the shareholders. Many companies say we're legally obliged to do that. But actually, we can also all think of companies that will be designed intentionally and differently, where their finance, their ownership, their governance, and their relationships are all in service to their purpose. So much harder to do that when you're part of the bigger system. We're hitting those system boundaries again. But for me, and at Doughnut Economic Action Lab, whenever a company comes, we say, this is how we talk about business. If you want to use the donut with business, you need to be looking at the deep design of your company, how it can get changed and where it's getting stuck, because that's the deepest leverage point of change.
I would definitely be bringing corporate psychotherapy as a term back to work. Thank you so much for that. I was frantically taking notes. I can see how the arrow, it kind of goes up and down between those 5 levels, and that concept again that, none of this is necessarily fixed. There's finances, it often gets a return, but doesn't have to in the way that we think of it. And one of the questions that had come out as well were, do you have an example of companies that are really doing this well? And you've given us a few: Tony's, Fairphone, El Puente. Do you have any others that you'd like to mention before we move on to another topic? Any other companies?
And just to say, you were scribbling frantically, that I should have said, everything I just said is written in more detail and with visuals and a workshop guide on our platform as a tool. It's in the Commons. It's called Doughnut Design for Business. If you want to look at it. And by the way, if you work in the area of urban development, real estate, or construction, we've also worked with several organizations to create a manual. It's called Doughnut for Urban Development. And it applies the donut and this deep design, looking specifically about buildings. Any other companies? I mean, what really matters? So sometimes I mention Tony's or Fairphone or El Puente, and many people in business will say they're tiny. Well, yes, they are tiny compared to the major players. But you know what? Once Apple was tiny, Microsoft was tiny, everything grows from somewhere. And we need to change the wider system to make them the norm. And maybe we don't want them to be giant. We don't want multinational dominance. We want many, many companies. I think it's really important, though, that there are named brands that people already know. So Patagonia, moving from being a family-owned company to something closer to steward-owned, where they divided the voting shares from the dividend shares. So there's one group who do all the voting about what the company should and shouldn't do, and it's very tightly guarding its principles or environmental and social integrity. And then the dividends go to another organization. That's important because people have heard of Patagonia. Oh, right, this is a brand, a successful brand that's doing this. And I think we hope to see more companies moving into steward ownership. Again, we can redesign business. It doesn't have to be what we've inherited from the 20th century. We can redesign things.
Great, thank you so much. I'll definitely be looking up those resources. So I appreciate that. I'm sure everybody else does too. And again, keep in mind we have an election coming, and I think these could be very useful if you're campaigning. So the next question then, to change tack a little bit, is about, it was mentioned earlier, who's in the room and who is not in the room. And this does relate to another question, which is about teaching and the education system. So there is a question up here, I'll try to get the exact language, but how do we make Doughnut Economics accessible, fun, interesting and relevant? to diverse and marginalized groups? How do we redistribute power to those without a voice, or I'd even say whose voice has been silenced? And in the questions that came in advance, there was a specific question around people who are coming to Ireland seeking asylum or a safe place to go. How do we ensure that they're within the donut?
How do we ensure that they're in the donut, or how do we make Doughnut Economics interesting to them?
So it's kind of a two-part question. The first one is around groups that maybe wouldn't be in a position of privilege to be able to engage in certain conversations around that are maybe seen as more academic or theoretical. And I suppose, for want of a better term, are maybe left behind in society. So how do we reach those groups? And one of those groups in particular, which is very live at the moment, is people coming to Ireland seeking asylum.
Great. So I can't speak to the Irish context, but what I've seen happening in Amsterdam, which was one of the first cities, both a community group, Amsterdam Doughnut Coalition, they went off with a bang in late 2019. And the city said, we're adopting doughnuts. And there's a lot of activity, which is why people call me up and say, I'm in Amsterdam, where is it? They want to see it. What happened at the beginning with doing this work with the community group in Amsterdam is they held events in a big theatre in the city centre. It was very shiny and big. And then over the years, when they invite me now, it's in the district, it's in the community, it's in the less served communities. There's people who said, I'm actually based in that community. These tools would be amazing to create a community conversation here, working with asylum seekers, with families who first generation immigrants who may not yet speak the language. Because if you look at the social foundation, I mean, that really speaks to people's issues. Do you have decent housing? Do you have access to healthcare, education? Do you have social justice? Do you have voice? I think it's a far more accessible and inviting economic conversation than most spaces that say they're talking about economics. So they've been running what they call donut bakeries in the neighborhoods. And I was really delighted to go to Amsterdam last year and be part of these local pop-up community groups. We are putting in a food digester in this place. We're working with the market traders here. Very, very grounded. And I think it's really important to recognize that is what it means to start changing our economies locally. It doesn't have to be a big national policy. It is very much about that local groundedness and creating spaces where people can talk about this in their own first language, where they can connect with others. They brought a group of people, asylum seekers, in an organization of asylum seekers in Amsterdam, came along to one of the workshops with others and said, this is how we want to be contributing here. So, of course, connecting with organizations that represent people and invite them in. How do we make this more relevant to you? How do we make your issues visible here? You could, for example, take the donut with a group of asylum seekers and say, on every single one of these dimensions, social and ecological, write down your lived experience. We don't have to only rely on data. Write your lived experience, write your needs, your deprivations, your expectations, and you could make visible a whole world that may not be visible to us who are not in that situation through using this as a frame.
Great. So really a tool for those two terms that popped out to me there were less served and community conversations, and of course donut bakeries, and using it as a way to uncover that qualitative experience, and then using that to improve that experience and bring people into the donut. So I think that's really tangible as a method of application. So we've only a few minutes left. So I have a couple of final questions. One is on the arts and how we might use arts as a common language, and specific examples that you may have come across of using the arts to articulate donut economics and engage communities. And then the last one is around, you mentioned earlier those roots, and we might not see the shoots quite yet, but what would those indicators of the roots actually thriving be for people in the room who, might have been doing this for a long time and gets a bit tiring? What are those indicators that we're actually making some progress in your experience? So just the arts and those roots. How do we?
Right. Okay. The arts. I'm so thrilled that so many artistic, creative people come to this and play with it. And maybe because it's visual from the beginning, an open invitation. People have danced the donut. From Cornwall, they did it in Cali in Colombia, pictures of people dancing in the donut. We did it this morning and stepping into the donut, just using physicality and using space. People have composed music to symbolize it. So many artistic ways of playing with it. And I think making things visual, making things playful, creative, and I think it's about moving through the whole body. I shall stand up again. The academia often holds us up here, right? We're interrogating words, concepts. It's very heady. One of the ways I love to teach my students is show them, when I'm talking about systems thinking, I show them a video of a murmuration of starlings, and they're sitting on the floor in the middle of a workshop, and I play the video, and they watch this video, and I watch them, because you can see they've moved here, and they're like, wow, this awe feeling, and they've moved into the heart space. But also, I think of it as moving into the belly, like laughter, using humor, using play, so that we can actually, sometimes there are things we can talk about when we use humor that are much harder. Actually, the previous time I came to Ireland, is because I went to Kilconomics in Kilkenny, where you are economists and comedians on stage. And I found myself able to make challenging comments to a corporate executive in a way that I wouldn't have, because it was through humor. So moving through the whole body. I personally have got really into economic circus. So this summer I was speaking at 2 festivals basically in circus tents. I found myself a big red top hat I bought in a vintage shop, and I've got not just little pieces of hosepipe, but giant swimming noodles for making economic growth charts. And I had a ball. And there's something about the permission of putting on a hat or a mask or a costume that means we will play and play big. In a different way. So I think the arts are invaluable. And it was so beautiful to hear the poem as well. Thank you. And the song. I mean, there's been so much art here today. Last one on the roots. So just to come back to cities, I'm just going to think of it there. Well, show me City Council. It was really wonderful to hear this example from Dublin City Council. Is it visible to everybody? No. Is it happening? Yes, there's something happening. It's not easy. And not everybody's on board, right? There's an internal push, but the relations start to be built. It starts to be written into a plan, and it will become visible later. Some of the cities we work with, it's being used to create, again, decision-making tools. It sounds very technical, but when it's technical, it's actually going quite deep, because it's changing the basis on which decisions are made. But I think also the roots of networks. Today, the roots of IDEN are quite visible, because many of you are literally in this room, but normally not in this room. So how do we make visible these networks? Because it encourages us, or people saying at my table, it's so encouraging to hear stories of others in other sectors. So we need to make these roots visible, whether we measure them or not. Measurement, we can get carried away with measurement, but visibility, whether it's in the room or showing it as a data visual online, I think is key, and then we know we're part of something so much bigger.
Well, that's just about it for our time on the Q&A. Got the mic now? Yeah, so thank you all so much for all of your questions, and a huge thank you to Kate